Well, welcome everyone. What a week it's been for social science. The whole festival has been fantastic, and we've also had a brilliant week showcasing some of the diverse aspects of our shared suffrage history via the Mapping Women's Suffrage Project. Last Saturday, we heard some inspiring stories from pioneering research undertaken by family and local historians. And then during the week, we had presentations that touched on all sorts of diverse aspects of the suffrage movement. For example, husband and wife dissent over support for the suffrage movement, which was played out on the pages of the 1911 census. And we looked at sex and the suffrage movement, including Frances Swiney, the suffrage campaigner who believed there should be sexual abstinence in marriage to leave at least 4 to 6 years between children. This is in spite of having 6 children herself in quick succession. We looked at the empowering nature of music and its role in the suffrage movement, which was accompanied by a new song, Deeds, inspired by the Mapping Women's Suffrage Project. And we looked at groundbreaking new work of Coventry Digital and Coventry Atlas, digital projects supporting the Coventry City of Culture. But I think one of my favourites was yesterday's contribution by the historian of the future, Isabeau, who found out from local Kent researcher Jennifer Godfrey that she was living in the childhood home of working class suffragette Ethel Baldock. This inspired Isabeau to compile a questionnaire for her neighbours to find out what they knew about their local suffrage history. And then she put together a PowerPoint presentation to enlighten them. I'd like to thank all of our wonderful contributors this week, and especially Mapping Women's Suffrage Project Coordinator, Tara Morton, for pulling everything together and working tirelessly behind the scenes to create many of the video presentations. But on to today. For this final event, we're looking at legacies of the suffrage movement, and we have some exceptional speakers to share their thoughts. I'm honoured to welcome Hannah Squire and Helen Bratt-Wyton of the National Trust, and Helen Pankhurst, women's rights activist, academic, writer, and advisor on national development. We're going to start then with Hannah and Helen. Hannah is Assistant Curator for National Programmes for the National Trust, and Helen is the House and Collections Manager of Whittick Manor near Wolverhampton. And they're going to start us off by highlighting some of the recent work of the National Trust.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's so wonderful to be involved in this event, and the whole festival has just been incredible. So yeah, thank you so much. So first we should introduce ourselves. So I'm as Hannah Squire, as Sarah said, and I work for the National Trust. And we're going to be talking a bit today about Women and Power programming, and also just the legacy of that in the Trust. And Helen, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Helen. I'm Helen Bratt-Wyton. I'm the Senior Collections and House Manager here as of last week at Whittick Manor. and I'm going to be discussing particularly what we did at Whittick Manor itself. So Hannah will give a more overview and I'll talk about more what we did at Whittick Manor. So to start us off, Hannah, are you going to tell us about what national public programming is and what it all means?
Yeah, so James, can we have the slide, please? Okay, so just to say, so this is the first slide, and this is a lovely photograph of two of the key figures we'll be talking about. So this is Geoffrey and Florence Mander with their children in the great parlour at Whittick Manor. And what's lovely actually is the painting in the background you can see just behind Geoffrey's head is actually by a women artist, and we'll be talking about the exceptional women artist collection at Whittick as well. So yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, so I want to talk a bit about an overview, a bit of a context of the National Trust's kind of involvement. So the National Public Programming team began in 2017, led by curator Rachel Lennon, and it was to look at 3 anniversaries, big anniversaries. So in 2017, it was 50 years since the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality, and we led a programme called Prejudice and Pride. Helen, I don't know if you wanted to briefly talk a bit about Whittick's involvement.
Yes, initially we were going to, because it was the first time the Trust had ever done that public programming, and so we were going to do it quite light touch here, kind of developed as the year went on to ended up being quite a significant part of the campaign. And we started looking into some of our artists, because we have quite a few artists at Whittick that have LGBTQ connections. We did a video with Dr. Caroline Conroy on Simeon Solomon, who was a gay artist, which we showed at the property and which we also had online. And it was a really, really successful year.
Great. And then, yeah, in 2018, obviously with the centenary of the 1918 Representation of the People Act, we had a really successful and really interesting year. So nearly 3 million visitors attended National Trust Women in Power events, exhibitions, installations. 88 National Trust properties got involved in some form. And yeah, so there's some really interesting key stories. So we released a podcast, a guidebook. It ranges from down the road at Dudmaston in Shropshire. We have Violet Ann Bland, who was a kitchen maid there, who became involved in the WSPU. She was imprisoned and force-fed. To we have Lady Edith, who you can see actually in the image here for Women in Power, from Mount Stuart in Northern Ireland, who was an ardent suffragist and a writer and a speaker. And then in 2019, to finish this kind of 3-year programme, it was the 200th anniversary of the Peterloo Massacre, and we looked at people coming together to fight for their rights in our landscape. So these were kind of meant as 3 separate years, but also it was really a springboard to continue to highlight and to tell these diverse range of stories more in the future. So yeah, if we could go on to the next slide, please, James. So I want to briefly talk about Women in Power, as well as those suffrage stories I mentioned. There are some other kind of, we looked generally in the Trust at women's agency, uncovering more of their stories and really celebrating, commemorating and highlighting. So the top image you can see is at Killerton. And it was kind of a family divided by politics. So that looked at the suffrage movement. So we looked at the Acklands, and Eleanor Ackland was a leading suffragist campaigner in direct opposition to her Aunt Gertrude, who was anti-suffrage. So you can imagine the conversations in that family. Just below that, you can see the portrait of Bess of Hardwick and Mary Beard. So at Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire, they looked at Bess of Hardwick and how the issues she dealt with 400 years ago as a powerful woman in society. Still, we can relate to those issues today, and they commissioned 20 portraits of women today who kind of responded to her story. And then on the right, we have the story at Tintersfields that really looked at Hannah More, and they had Holly Caulfield Carr, you can see there standing up, who was their poet in residence, who looked at women's representation and women's voices as environmentalists and poets, both in the past and today. So that's kind of an overview of some of the different ways that we sort of celebrated and looked at women's stories in 2018 in the National Trust. Okay, if you can go on to the next slide, please. So as we're kind of focusing, looking a bit at one particular property at Whittick Manor, I thought Helen's collection house manager could really start by just telling us a bit about the place for people that have no idea about the property. So Helen, over to you.
So Whittick Manor, as you can see in these beautiful photographs, was built in 1887 for the Mandel family, who were a local industrialist family of the liberal persuasion. So Whittick was very much furnished and decorated under the influence of the House Beautiful lecture. So Theodore and his wife Flora had been to Oscar Wilde's House Beautiful lecture in Wolverhampton. Theodore took his notebook, wrote loads of notes, and the house was really kind of furnished and decorated under that influence. If you'd been to the House Beautiful lecture and you got nice deep pockets like the Manders, there were two shops of choice. You either went to Liberty on Regent Street or Morris and Co on Oxford Street. And our family went to the Morris Company. They were readers of Ruskin, so they're very interested in, you know, art and environmentalism, and they built the house with these beautiful Morris interiors, which it is so famous for now. The art collection that we have at Whittick, we have this amazing collection of pre-Raphaelite art. That came much later, that came with the second generation of the family to live here. And that is very much a collaboration between the family and the National Trust, and that started in 1937. And we have this really unique collection of art at Whittick, because the Manders, although they brought a few of the big blousy oils, that wasn't particularly what they were interested in. They loved art that had a story. And they loved art that had connections, whether they were literary connections or biographical connections, which means our art really tells different stories. But also a lot of the art that they brought, they acquired from descendants of the pre-Raphaelite artists themselves, which brought a much wider field of artists into their view, which now means that Whittick has this amazing collection of art created by women. And we actually have the art of 13 female artists on permanent display at Whittick, which is really quite unique when you consider that the National Gallery only has 13 female artists, and it's much bigger than Whittick. So can we have the next slide, please?
So, Helen, can you tell us a bit more about the artists, female artists at Whittick?
So here you can see some of the art created by women at Whittick. And as I said, you know, we've got the work of 13 female artists on permanent display. The National Gallery, as I said, also has 13, but there's only equates to 21 works of art, whereas actually equates to over 35 works of art on permanent display. And that doesn't include all of the art created by the wider pre-Raphaelite arts and crafts movement in, you know, talking about things like the embroideries and things like that, the more applied arts. Or most of these women were successful artists within their own lifetimes, and were considered on a par with a lot of the leading male artists at the time, but their stories and their art, as so many women's stories have been forgotten over time. So here you can see on the top left is the tomb scene from Romeo and Juliet by Lucy Maddox Brown. Lucy Maddox Brown also went on to become a biographer and wrote a really good biography of Mary Shelley, which is still in print. Bottom left is an oil by Gertrude Spencer Stanhope of her sister Winifred Stanhope. And then you've got Evelyn de Morgan's The Mourners on the right. We have quite a large collection of work by Evelyn de Morgan, and she exhibited very widely in the top galleries of her time, and her work really commanded quite large sums of money during her lifetime. And we also have a de Morgan gallery at Whittick now as well. So we've got a separate gallery filled with the art of Evelyn de Morgan and the ceramics of her husband, William de Morgan. And we do that in collaboration with the de Morgan Foundation. And that's been with us for 3 years and is a really quite exceptional partnership. And Hannah is a wonderful curated, fabulous exhibition that we opened last year in there called Look Beneath the Lustre. So if you haven't been, you must come and see it. It's really rather amazing. And then the last picture you can see in the bottom centre, that's by Elizabeth Eleanor Siddall, and it's called The Haunted Wood. And Hannah, are you going to tell us about the exhibition you created on Siddall for 2018?
Yeah, if we could go to the next slide, please. Fabulous. So in 2018, so I should say I used to work at Whitwick as a conservation assistant, and before I became part of the national team, I worked on our programming property. And so when I was looking behind the scenes, we have this amazing collection, 12 artworks by Elizabeth Siddall, second largest public collection in the world, after the Ashmolean, not that we're counting or competitive about that. Yeah, and they've never all been framed together on display, and I thought 2018 was a perfect year to celebrate Elizabeth Siddall in her own right as an artist and poet. And it was interesting, the initial discussions that we had with other colleagues, there wanted to be kind of more a focus on the melodrama of her life, which you might know about the overdose of laudanum and various other things. And we kind of actually thought, no, we really want to focus on her artistic style, her output, as a poet as well, and the theme she was interested in. And so, yeah, we put this incredible exhibition on display for the first time I worked on, and we had some really lovely feedback as well. As you can see there, Georgia, 10-year-old, giving her feedback. And we worked with Dr. Jan Marsh as well on that. So, yeah, if we could have the next slide, please. So Helen, I've talked a bit about the Siddall exhibition and the art side of the programming at Whitwick. Do you want to talk about the activism and what, the links to suffrage at Whitwick?
So during the year, obviously we had, as Hannah said, we had the exhibition of Siddall's work, but we also did lots of other things. So we focused with Whitwick, we called our part of Women and Power, we called it art and activism, because we very much felt it was those two parts to the campaign. So we had a wonderful badge, as you can see at the top left, created based on the suffrage badge that we gave to volunteers and to staff and to visitors, which everybody really enjoys. And so much so we had to have 2 more lots of them created. In the end, we had to say, sorry, we're out of them now because they were so popular. And we really wanted to focus as well on the links the managers had to the suffrage movement. So during the year, we commissioned artist in residence, Kate Charlesworth, who did a number of installations throughout the house. The Silent Companion, so you can see one on the bottom left there. And there were a number of those throughout the house, and she kind of looked at women associated with Whitwick and their links to suffrage. She also created a number of banners that you can see that were represented how women were viewed and also how the connections to local campaigners and how underrepresented women artists are in galleries around the country and around the world. And she also got in touch with the Guerrilla Girls, which is a campaign group about getting more women into galleries and museums, and they allowed her to use some of their iconography. And you worked quite closely with Kate, didn't you, Hannah?
Yeah, it was really good to kind of explore and to research more of the women associated with Whitwick, both the family and also the artists, writers, poets, various people. And one last thing to say about this slide, the image, the top middle, was the volunteers spontaneously decided to create a play, actually particularly looking at Emmeline Pankhurst at Whitwick, and they put this on, they did it all themselves, and they had like visitor participation. So that was kind of really lovely interactive thing to see as well. So
yes, it was absolutely amazing. And Emma, Sam Rather, who you can see in the front right, she wrote it, and it's based on the trial of Emmeline Pankhurst. It was initially only meant to be performed once, and I think they performed it about 7 or 8 times throughout the year. You know, any excuse to don the costumes, and they had an amazing time, and visitors absolutely loved it. It was really, really successful. And also we put around the house a number of statistics. So in little frames around the house, one of our colleagues, Vicky, put these little snippets of statistics around the house about women's place and representation in the artwork and in politics, which led to some really great reactions and debates between visitors and volunteers. It was really interesting to see, you know, people's reactions to these, just statements of facts. There was no qualifying of the facts. There was no trying to interpret the facts, you know, just a series of facts that we put around the house, and it really worked very well. So, Hannah, how far did suffrage go back at Wittick?
Yes, you could have the next slide, please. So I started looking up and researching into the family's connections. Well, we didn't actually know the family connected at all before 2018. I was looking generally at Wolverhampton and the suffragist and suffragette movement locally, and came across them. So Samuel Small-Mander, who's in the photo on the left, it was his son Theodore that built Wittick. But so we found links to women's suffrage back to the 1870s, and so Lydia Becker came to speak in Wolverhampton, and I actually didn't know too much about Lydia Becker before, but I found out that she was the secretary of the Manchester National Society of Women's Suffrage, the first of its kind, editor of the Women's Suffrage Journal, and reading Emmeline Pankhurst's My Own Story, finding out how inspirational she was to a teenage Emmeline Pankhurst as well. And what was lovely is we saw that Samuel Small-Mander talked about the fact that he thought that women should be able to speak in Parliament, and the Manders were kind of Congregationalists, non-conformists, and they believed in women sort of having a leading role in faith as well. So we can date it back to the 1870s that we know Samuel Small-Mander speaking out that women should be able to speak in Parliament. Okay, so next slide, please.
So Hannah, excitingly, we discovered that Wittick itself had served as a location for suffrage debate. Do you want to tell us some more about that?
Yeah, so when I was in Wolverhampton City Archives, they have this really lovely book. So it's the annual reports of the Wolverhampton Women's Suffrage Society meetings, and there were suffragists. And I was kind of just going through it, and then I came across the fact that in 1913, in December, the Manders got involved in the movement and actually held a meeting actually on site in the drawing room. So Mrs. Archibald Little came and spoke about women of the East and the West. So her and her husband had been living in China for quite a while. And she looked at the relationship between Chinese and British women's involvement in society, and looked at the constraints on them to do with corsets and foot binding. And obviously she had a very particular kind of colonial attitude to this, with a kind of British superiority. But I think it's really interesting that Wittick, they were discussing the idea of women's position in both Chinese and British society. And this meeting was hosted by Florence Mander, and Geoffrey Mander was involved as well. So it's lovely to see they actually held suffragist meetings on site. And you can see in the picture there on the right, we set up the room in 2018 to kind of resemble what we thought a meeting might be like. So visitors could come and see and kind of read the pamphlets that were there and just see, the actual site's involvement. So next slide, please.
So, Hannah, Florence, Geoffrey's first wife, has always been quite a shadowy figure at Wittick. How was she brought out from the shadows, and how was her campaigning discovered?
Thank you, Helen. Yes, so I started volunteering at Wittick when I was at uni about 10 years ago, and I was first told that Florence was interested in London society, didn't spend much time here, wasn't really interested in Wolverhampton or in Wittick, which turned out to be complete nonsense. Finding her in that annual report, finding out that she joined the local suffragist movement in 1912, that she was an active member, she became the president of Wolverhampton Women's Liberal Society, and then also that quote there at the bottom in 1921 that we found that she said about how important women's vote is and their involvement in politics and in society. And the image on the far right is one of Kate Charlesworth's brilliant installations at Wittick. So we really wanted to bring her out of the shadows, You can also see we created YouTube content as well, a bit about her and about the women at Whitwick. So it was lovely to kind of rediscover her. And her and Geoffrey were also involved in the suffragist pilgrimage in 1913. They also supported it when it came to Wolverhampton. So yeah, just doing more research and uncovering her story. Because she was the first wife and she divorced Geoffrey, there wasn't really much known about her beforehand. So next slide, please.
So Geoffrey is a really interesting character. And in your research, Hannah, what did you discover about him?
Yeah, so we knew he was a radical Liberal MP. He was involved in international relations, that he was interested in workers' rights. But I went through all of Hansford records we had with him. So he was in Parliament from 1929 to 1945. And it's amazing how often he talks up women's issues and about women's rights. So he wanted more women magistrates, more women policemen, restrictions on hours for laundry workers, increased maternity benefit, more maternity accommodation. You can see here on the right, this is an example of one of his speeches. He also, I thought was really lovely, in 1931, he put forward a domestic service bill to kind of look at female domestic workers and how they were being treated, and specifically in terms of suffrage. He spoke out quite often about that he thought women in the early 1910s, that women over the age of 21 should all be able to vote. So it was lovely to discover this other kind of side of him that we didn't know about. So next slide, please. Yeah, so also to find out that our housekeeper, Emma Smith at Whitwick, was also involved in the movement. When I was transcribing her letters with Elizabeth Taylor, a colleague of mine, we came across that she went in 1900 to this lecture given by Sarah Grand, who is this writer and activist who coined the term New Woman, who wrote really interesting novels. And I discovered in the local paper that this is a quote from the talk that she gave, and it was really great that our housekeeper, as well as Whitwick, was involved in these debates, attending these meetings. So that was something new we discovered as well. So next slide, please.
That was really unusual for the time, though, wasn't it? That the Manders actually encouraged her to go to this talk.
Definitely, yeah, Helen, that's really good. Another key figure is Princess Sadira Amanda, who we're looking at the moment, actually, more research into her. So Princess Sadira, the daughter of the Maharaja Maharina of Kush Mahal, married, so Geoffrey Amanda, who inherited Whitwick. His younger brother Alan married Sadira in 1914, and Sophie Duncan and Rachel Lennon, their research, they uncovered that she campaigned for better relations between England and India. She spoke out for Indian women's rights to vote. She worked with the VAD in the First World War. So she was a really interesting figure. And on the right is her mother, Sunita Devi, who wrote this really great autobiography about an Indian princess in English society. She founded a girls' school. There was actually a statue to her in India. So yeah, to have these connections as well that we're exploring. Next slide, please.
So legacy. So it was kind of always our intention for the Women and Power Year to have a substantive legacy. All of the interpretation that was researched predominantly by Hannah and written for 2018 remains on display now. It's become part of the story that we tell every day. The women artists have become part of the story that we tell every day. And in fact, we're moving our female artists ever more into more prominent positions. So if you're a regular visitor to Whitwick, you will notice that some of these artists are coming from being in little corners out into far more prominent positions. And the photograph you can see on the top right, we've moved 3 of our female artists into the first room that you go into. So you can see the tomb scene there, and it's flanked either side by 2 Lizzie Siddalls. We've increased our talks program, so we do an annual talks program, and now women within this movement are far more prominent within it. And we've actually found that anything we do on the women outsells the men, 2 to 1 at least. So everything we do on the women is normally a sellout. So there's a real appetite by the visiting public to come and see these things and to come to the talks about the women. Hannah and I have done conference papers on the subject on different parts of our collection. and there's this real kind of appetite for the women within these movements. And of course, one of the other things that we've done as well is that Florence is now on the Mapping Women's Suffrage map. So if you go on to there, that you will see Florence is on there. So that is all the legacies of the year that we did for Women in Power, and it just carries on. And the research didn't end at the end of that year. It carries on and on and on, and we're finding out more and more all the time. So Hannah, you're going to talk us through some of the stuff you've been doing recently.
Very quickly, I'll just mention that, so in the top left, when we are at the moment looking at our inclusive histories and covering more about Whittick's global connections, we've really looked to do more research with our Oxford Research Partnership into Sadira, and her sister Prithiva also married Lionel, the other Manda brother. So 2 Indian princesses married 2 of the Manda brothers. So uncovering more about her and telling her story. In the bottom left, you can see the Look Beneath the Lustre exhibition that I curated, which looks at Evelyn de Morgan as an artist. It looks at her model and muse as well, Jane Hell, so looking at a working class woman's story as well, and also a queer relationship there, and uncovering the stories of the workers behind this artwork and their inspiration. And then on the bottom far right, you can see a slightly unfortunate photograph of me, Facebook Live event. So we're trying to do more as well online to talk about our collections. And that was a talk because it's the 125th anniversary of the imprisonment of Oscar Wilde this year. We're talking a bit more about him. So yeah, I think that's it. Yeah. So really exciting legacy going forward, and just more generally in the trust as well, we're looking at uncovering more of a diverse range of women's stories to continue to tell. Oh, Sarah, I think you're on mute.
Yes, thank you. I did mute myself so that I didn't interrupt you. But that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, Hannah and Helen. But before we have a wider discussion of some of the issues that you've raised about diverse histories and the way that they're communicated and disseminated to the public, I'd like to bring in Helen Pankhurst if we can. So I'm really pleased to welcome Helen, who, as I've said, is a scholar, a writer, a women's activist. I guess, Helen, this question I'm going to ask you first. It's one that you hear a lot, but I know your grandmother Sylvia died before you were born, but I wondered whether your own activism today has been inspired by the suffrage movement and your illustrious relatives in particular.
Hi, and good evening, everybody. Yes, you know, very much Sylvia was an influence for me, both because of the suffragette background, but also because she then she got involved in so many different issues and ended up living in Ethiopia, which is where I was born. So that interest in international issues and issues of justice, of valuing the culture of a different country, of Pan-Africanism, so many other things that Sylvia brought, but also intrinsically that feminism, which I, as a young woman, felt was still something that we needed to campaign about. So I've been very privileged to have that background, and it's very much molded everything that I've done.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to say that anyone can ask questions. So if you've got any questions for any of our speakers today, please put them in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that and make sure that I feed them in. But we did ask for a few advanced questions, and I've got another follow-up one for you, Helen, from Jennifer Godfrey. And she asks, how does it make you feel to be speaking at a festival, hearing about even more stories of all those people from a wide variety of backgrounds that met and interacted and followed your great-grandmother? Have you got any favourite accounts of Emmeline?
So isn't it wonderful that this is it's a national and it's an international story, and the more we dig, the more we find out how many people were involved in one way or another, and often in complex ways. So within families, as we heard earlier on, different women within the family taking different positions, or often their positions changing over time. And I think there's a great appetite to understand the ordinary campaigners, the foot soldiers of the movement. And I love the fact that we're uncovering more and more. In terms of the link to Emmeline and my my grandmother and great-grandmother, it's always, for me, lovely how excited people are to meet me because of that link to history, that link with the surname, that link with the kind of genetic factors, and just the enthusiasm. And in particular, youngsters, you know, the 10, 11-year-old girls who come up to me and say, you know, I really look up to one or other of them, and so on. So that's been, it's a joy to see that enthusiasm and that link to history, which there's so few examples of it still. We need a lot more of it, and the suffragettes and the suffragists are a big part of that story for many people. In terms of anecdotes, the one that comes to mind at the moment, which just makes me laugh, is the one of whether true or not, that somebody said, you know, what would Emmeline, what would God make of Emmeline's antics? You know, put very derogatory, to which her response, of course, was, "I'm sure she would approve."
Yeah, I mean, they're such larger than life characters. Both Emmeline, Christabel, and Sylvia, of course, and very, very different perspectives and views. So there are just fantastic stories. But I've got a more sort of current question that I'd like to throw out. Perhaps I could ask Hannah or Helen from National Trust to go first on this one, and it's about statues. So you will know, you'll have known that this week there's been quite a lot of discussion in the press about the new statue of Mary Wollstonecraft. But I wondered, I mean, statues are such a hot topic of debate, and they have been this summer, from the tearing down of Colston's statue in Bristol to, as I say, the current discussion about Mary Wollstonecraft. So what are your views about statues of historical figures? Should we be erecting more of them, or should we be tearing them down?
Ooh.
Do you want to go first, Helen? Or
this is my personal opinion. It's not the opinion of the National Trust. Is that we don't learn history from statues. First of all, we learn history from books and archives. But even though we don't learn history from statues, I think that it is important that there should be more women represented in statues. There can be a lot of debate on the quality of public art. So whether the statue of Mary Wollstonecraft is good quality public art, that is a matter of debate. But there should be more women represented, because if you looked at statues and took them as history, there would only be rich white men who lived in the past, and Queen Victoria would be the only woman. So, you know, I think it's important that we get more representation of women in our public spaces, but I don't necessarily believe that we learn history from them. But I think it's important that more women should be there.
Yeah, I was kind of reiterate. I've been listening to lots of debates recently, and I think David Olusogo, kind of to reiterate what Helen said, that idea that statues aren't always particularly great at telling history, and the position of them is interesting, whether to be in museums or whether out in public space. Once again, this is my opinion, not the Trust, but we're having some interesting discussions in the Trust as well with our statues and how we interpret, how we display them at the moment, which are sort of ongoing. But I think definitely we should have more women in public space statues of real women, not sort of mythical fantasy creatures, but really look at how we represent them. But there's definitely a power dynamic in these spaces. And I know for myself and my childhood, walking around and kind of seeing representations, how important they are in our public spaces, and also to make sure they're as intersectional as possible, to look at lots of different women's stories. So yeah, I think it is important to have more. Yeah.
Yeah, and not I'd like to say. Let me start by saying that I wish that there were more, to just add to what Hannah's just said, I wish that there were more of a variety of voices and perspectives of history that were represented symbolically through statues. And for example, there's been a long campaign to have one of Sylvia Pankhurst, and interestingly, there isn't one of her, and there are two of Emmeline. And it's for political reasons. Sylvia represented a much more left-wing position and a more unacceptable one, because she challenged the state in many ways, not just in the suffragette activism. And therefore, it's been harder to get funding, money, to support her position. So, you know, that point of who has the money and who is part of the establishment and then visible, and who isn't. And I think over time, what's really interesting is when you retell the story in a more nuanced way. So your powerful slave owner man, you can do very interesting things by putting other images next to or information by that statue to tell the wider story of who is abused and who has power, etc. There are also very interesting feminist ways in which this has been done. So, for example, with knitted jumpers on some of the male statues in some, I think this was in Manchester, and in the I can't remember exactly where, but there was this whole exhibition of knitted jumpers on every single statue of a white man. So lots of ways in which we could be doing it differently. I also think that there's been this question about whether statues of women should be conceptualized differently in some ways. And I know that when the Emmeline statue in Manchester was being thought about, and I was involved in the panel on that, there was this idea that we didn't want her to be up at a distance on some large plinth and at a much larger scale, that having her closer to people, and in this case on a chair, surrounded by a meeting circle, where people could approach and be closer to her, felt like a more feminist perspective. And also there was this attempt to show both her frailty and her power, and so not to use the statue in a slightly different way. Moving on briefly to the very controversial one right now of Mary Wollstonecraft. I mean, there was actually a competition and two designs were put forward. One was a very conventional one, and the other is the one that won that voting procedure, which was a more symbolic idea of how to represent the birth of feminism, symbolically, what she represents. And a lot of people have hated it. A lot of people have not liked the nudity of the figure at the front, or the symbolic description of this emergence. But it has created massive controversy, massive visibility. And I personally feel sorry for those organizers of the campaign, because I think they put their heart into it. And it's very easy to mock, it's very easy to criticize, and possibly question mark, is it easier to do it when you're trying to do something differently? So in my view, we can like or dislike, but let's have a really interesting debate about it without resorting to really rather unpleasant language around it, which I think is unfortunately what seems to have happened with that statue. But it's been lovely to see a lot of the discussions all the same, and you know, the amount of visibility that particular statue has gained, I think has been incredible. And I hope that it leads beyond the is it a good statue or not, to who was she, what did she do, why is she important?
I think as well, occupying that public space, it's amazingly how emotive it is. So I went the day the Militant Forces statue was unveiled, and I just broke down. And it wasn't only me, there were others. I started to cry just to have her in that space, Parliament, and to have her surrounded in a dialogue with those other sculptures created by men. It just showed to me how important it is to feel like you're a part of that geography.
And also, interestingly, in that case, there's this ribbon with many other suffragists and suffragettes honoured at that same militant statue. And that's also interesting because instead of just propping up the single person, that statue has attempted to put that single person in the story of wider suffrage issues. By the way, one of the other initiatives is where you have a single man on a statue is to have a story of who the women are that made that man able to be the person that he was. That's another kind of way of contextualizing the story and giving it a richer history.
I mean, we're quite lucky here in this part of the Midlands in that we do have some really interesting public art that depicts women. In one of the Black Country villages called Bilston, there's an absolutely fabulous, huge statue of women miners, of a woman miner. So the head is actually an anvil. It's quite conceptual about the metal bashing of the Black Country. And then stripped away, so women miners were stripped away. And huge statue, and it's quite beloved in the area. So it's quite interesting that it hasn't caused any controversy and that it's really, really quite a prominent statue within the area. I waffled a bit then.
No, that's fantastic, and I think what we'd all like to get away from is the celebration of sort of the great men and great women debate, and to talk about the more diverse contributions that there were to whether it's the suffrage movement or feminism, or in general, or trade unionism or work. And that's what I think the benefit of the discussion about Mary Wollstonecraft, or the controversy, is that more people know about her and know about her work now than ever would have done, I guess, if it had been a very conventional picture of an 18th century lady on a green in London. So I'm like Helen Pankhurst in some ways. I'm glad that the organisers were brave enough to go with or went with a popular vote and chose that version, because I think it, the legacy of that in some ways, or the immediate response, is that everyone's talking about Mary Wollstonecraft, which is great. Thinking about the suffragettes then in particular, what do you think is their greatest legacy? And throw it open to anyone.
Shall I start?
Yes.
So I have a theory on this, which is that if you look at change, it's not my theory, it's a structural conceptualization of change, is that there are three elements to that. There's the agency of individuals, there's changing social norms, and then there's policy or legal changes. And I think when you look at the suffragettes, in some ways you're looking at that legal change, the right to vote. But the suffragists were doing that as well. And for me, what the suffragettes achieved beyond anything else was the change in social norms. They created this massive discussion around the rights for women and the position of women in society. And they did that through the agency, through the really, really powerful agency of individuals saying, no, not good enough. We are going to change things and we will make a difference. So that combination between this real active agency of individuals that changed social norms in such a powerful way that 100 and more years later, they're the ones that still appeal. And it's not because of that change in the law, it's because of the change in social norms and the agency of these amazing women.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's that idea for me, it's that collective coming together to fight for a common cause, and the various and diverse kind of range you do that, whether that's the kind of the art that you create, the writing that you put out there, the different avenues you do that. But I think it's definitely that idea of collectively kind of coming together as women, and a diverse range of women, to kind of look at a wide range of issues, so not just the vote, but kind of how, as Helen Pankhurst said, like the whole structure of society and how women were treated in a diversity of ways. So I think it's that collective conscious.
No, I was thinking you know, with these suffragettes as opposed to the suffragists, is that, you know, the suffrage campaigns have been going on for a long time and nothing had changed. Nothing had moved forward. They were in exactly the same position that they were 30 years before. And it was only really with the suffrage militancy that I think really publicised women's suffrage, put it on the front page of the newspapers, where they were lucky to get many reports into what they were doing peacefully. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, nobody gives you anything, you have to fight for it.
Mm.
You know, all through history, you know, with the extension of men's suffrage and, you know, with fighting for freedom, you know, with India fighting for freedom from the British Empire, is that it wasn't given to them. They had to fight for it peacefully, but they fought for it. They had demonstrations. And I think the suffrage militancy is very much part of that, is that, you know, you have to fight for what we want. And these women did, and they were incredibly brave. And I think that's why we're still talking about them today, and why their story is so current, is, you know, these women risked their lives, they risked their health to give us vote.
It's certainly the case that it's demonstrated how adding disruption into established political norms can have a greater effect than sort of being incorporated into an established discourse, particularly when you're a minority or generally excluded from it. And I think that to me is a lesson that's been taken up by quite a lot of you know, current campaigners to some extent. But as we focus on the suffragettes or on the suffragists, there's a question that's coming from Susan Richardson from Manchester. And she's not a relative of mine, I'd like to say, which is about the First World War. Now, often there is a discussion about whether, you know, women got the vote after the First World War because they participated in the war effort. But Susan's question is more about whether the war, which left so many women managing families on their own, contributed to the success of the suffrage movement. Or do you think that women would have got the vote anyway?
It suits the male narrative that it's the war that gave women the vote. It doesn't suit the male narrative that it's women's agency and their disruptive agency that gave women the vote. 4 years. Now, in 4 years, if there hadn't been the war, would women have got the vote earlier or not? I would put my money on they would have got it earlier. So actually the war delayed things rather than sped things up. And there's a lot of complexity around this. The fact that you know, Emmeline and Christabel and some aspects of the suffragettes only got involved in the war effort with that quid pro quo that women would get the vote at the end of it. So, you know, they were needed and therefore they supported the war effort, but with that full knowledge that they would be recompensed with women getting the vote at the end. Meanwhile, women get the vote for political reasons, only those who are older than 21, meaning those who are least likely to have been involved directly in the war effort. And yet the government's statement is that it's those women who were involved in the war effort, it's because they did that they get the vote. The inconsistencies in the storyline is really what I'm highlighting. So I would say that it would have happened early in any case, and it would have happened earlier. And it suits the establishment to say that it's the war that gave women the vote.
And the British Empire had been in lots of wars beforehand. You know, when you think of the Crimea, and there were lots of women that were left as widows to bring up families on their own, and we didn't get the vote then. You know, lots of women contributed to the war effort in the Crimea. You know, you think of Florence Nightingale and people and her nurses going over there. We didn't get the vote then. So the difference is the suffrage movement.
I completely agree as well about framing it by wars. I mean, I went to a girls' school, and it was great in many aspects, but still, everything was framed by the First World War, the Second World War, the Victorian era. Like, we only learned about the suffrage as like a kind of an adjunct to the First World War. Like, it was ridiculous. So yeah, I think framing it by wars, framing it by men's power and agency, I don't think is right or helpful.
There's a question on from the public, I think from Elizabeth, who says, I don't know if Emily can get this up for us, but it says, can I ask Helen to remind us that there was one Pankhurst who's not been mentioned yet? She was the first martyr for the cause in 1911 and has been forgotten except here in Brighton.
Yes, so Mary Clark, Emmeline's sister, died as a consequence of the brutality inflicted on her while she was campaigning. And Elizabeth Dewar is one of a group. She's leading a campaign to try and get greater, and has done already a lot of work to try and get greater recognition and knowledge about her in Brighton. And that story, and she's right that we need to know more about her more broadly. But again, it's right around the country. There are so many amazing women that need to be remembered, and they might not have the Pankhurst surname, but still they were doing incredible things, both those related and those that are not related. And it's just wonderful to get more and more knowledge about these, and for local historians, local women, local girls to become interested. And I think this is where the mapping suffrage initiative is so wonderful, in that it's individual local historians, local people putting together mapping, but also putting a jigsaw puzzle together of these stories. It's wonderful.
Yes, I mean, there's so many people who deserve to have recognition for the things that they did. I mean, we've had some tremendous stories this week that have been highlighted. And as you say, Helen, most of the work is being done by local communities, school children, people who are just fascinated by the story and then inspired to find out that there was a suffragette or a suffragist living down their street or living in their house. And I think that's what's forgotten, is those hundreds of thousands of people who fought for the cause and also fought against the cause. It was a sort of very divisive issue of the day, and it divided families, divided communities, and we need to remember that side of it as well. So it's great that there's this campaign in Brighton, and I hope if we haven't got her on the map, we'll get her on the map quickly. We're getting near to the end, but I just wondered if we could end with a question on how relevant you think the suffragette legacy is for current campaigns. I mean, I'm thinking of things like Black Lives Matter, obviously, after the events of the summer, the Me Too movement, Extinction Rebellion, as Hannah and Helen from National Trust have highlighted LGBTQ rights and sort of other diverse histories. Hannah,
I think the suffrage campaigning has almost kind of become a blueprint for other campaign groups. Kind of see how it's done. You had, diverse groups wanting the same thing but going about it in different ways, but they didn't try to compete with each other. So I think that they've created almost a blueprint that other campaigns can use.
Yeah, I think they were incredibly good at marketing, and they're looking at their own image and how they were being perceived in public. So yeah, I definitely think, and also I think their use of humour, I think as well, is really interesting. And I think it's an interesting technique, oratorial kind of technique, and kind of going out into crowds, going out into city centres and talking to people. I think is incredibly important, and having those debates and having those conversations as much as possible. I don't think you can ever talk too much. So yeah, I think incredibly important. I think having that passion, and like I think was said earlier, kind of really putting yourself on the line, I think, is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think the power of resistance, demanding change, not just quietly, nicely asking for it, but saying this won't do, things have to change. That power of resistance is they look back on the suffragettes quite consciously in some cases to see what lessons they can learn from that. And it's interesting, Helen's point about the different tapestry of organizations that existed 100 years ago with the suffrage movement, with differences of view, very, very strong differences of opinion. We see that playing out as well. So, for example, in the environmental movement, from the extreme, the more activist Extinction Rebellion to less so. And I think managing that tension, managing it well, is something that's really important, because these campaigns flourish when they can bring on board a whole range of views, and they're often destroyed from within if they start splintering. So I guess my concern or my thought is, how do they make sure that they learn from the best of that campaign 100 years ago, and don't fall foul of some of the problems that they encountered? I mean, in my case, it was even within a single family, so
Well, thank you so much, Helen and Hannah, for joining us to have this really interesting discussion about the legacies of the suffrage movement, and for bringing to the fore some of the work that the National Trust is doing in trying to diversify our understanding of histories, but also to showcase some of its collections, which I think are probably much less well known than the sort of iconic, massive, country houses and things like that. So within the walls of those houses, there's often really interesting histories from the housekeepers, as you've said, to intermarriage into amongst diverse groups of people. So thank you everyone for coming, and I think that this event concludes Warwick's contribution to the ESRC Festival of Social Science, and it's been a really tremendous week of fascinating sort of insights, and it just shows you the sort of power of social science research and how it speaks to citizens today and issues today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much.